Okay.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Don Mariansky. I'm the Canisius Lake Watershed Inspector. I'm excited to welcome John here to talk about aquatic macroinvertebrates. So John's a graduate of Monroe Community College and has his master's and bachelor's from Rockport in environmental science and biology. He's currently in his fourth year teaching at Finger Lakes Community College as an assistant professor of environmental conservation. Prior to his time at Finger Lakes, he was a full-time research scientist in the wetland lab at SUNY Rockport. And he also taught at the SUNY Rockport Biology Department, the Department of Environmental Science and Ecology, and the Delta College program.
Wonderful.
Enough without your assistance.
Yeah, I think I'll switch up the camera to see the desktop screen.
I'm going to share my screen through here. Can people see it?
We need to share from here. Here.
There you go.
We're gonna get that point.
I'm working on it. My hands are real jittery. One way to do it.
It's good.
That's better for everybody. Thanks for the invite out here. I really enjoy opportunities where I get to speak with members of the public and share my passion for science and especially related to wildlife. So growing up, I was a classic science nerd, and really from the time I was, in kindergarten, grade school, was really drawn to wildlife, and that has not left me. And I'm fortunate enough that I get to do that now for a career. But as a wildlife scientist, one thing that I've seen when it comes to the public is people are drawn to birds, mammals, and such, and less to the amphibians, reptiles that I study for a living, and even more so the insects that are out there. And sometimes that lack of understanding of them leads to a lack of caring and conservation. And my goal by the end of this talk is that you understand the role that they're playing in our ecosystem, how they're vital to the health of our watersheds, and how their presence is really impacting the quality of the water that's just to the south of us. So one thing I love about science is we do a great job of describing what we're talking about with the words we're using. One example I can give you, as I mentioned, my specialty amphibians, so salamanders and frogs, and probably my favorite salamander in this area, the slimy salamander. Its name is Plethodon glutinosus. Plethodon, that word, you hear pletha, like plethora, means it has lots of. You probably also picked up dont, like orthodontist, so it has lots of teeth. And then glutinosus means full of glue. So this is a salamander that produces this especially sticky substance where if something goes to bite it, it can essentially get lockjaw from it. So the aquatic macroinvertebrates that I'm talking about today, we have the same instance here. So there's some roots that I think that everybody in this audience and probably those who are joining me remotely can pick out, right? So we have aquatic, we have macro, and we have invertebrates. So let's break these down. And I know there are a few younger people in here, but when I'm talking about aquatic species, where are we looking for them? I'm not trying to talk over your head. I saw people little kids, right? So people never know your audience until the first time you're talking to somebody, right? Yeah, so absolutely. We're looking at organisms that live in the water. This one might give you a little more of a challenge. Macro. Think macro versus micro. What's going to be my cutoff in that? Because I could be looking at, microorganisms that are in the water, but today we're looking at macro. So where do you think we draw that line?
Visible with the eye.
Visible with the unaided eye. So these organisms are large enough that I can look at it, you know, in the water in my hand and be able to tell you a name. And then invertebrate, I think, is a pretty easy one for everybody in here, right? So we're talking about animals that lack a backbone or spine. So really, to put this all together, we're looking at organisms without backbones that are spending a large majority, if not their entire lifespan, in the aquatic ecosystem, and they're large enough that we can identify them without having to use complex equipment like compound microscopes. One of the things I want you to understand today is the importance of these to the scientific community, in that we use these aquatic macroinvertebrates as bioindicators, meaning the presence or the absence of these species is really telling us a lot about the water body, the health of it, where we're finding them. So certain species may indicate that a stream is not impaired, that it is healthy. In their absence may indicate that there's some sort of pollution event happening there that's led to them basically dying off. And those are the streams where we want to put a lot of our money, our time, and our focus. So with that, aquatic macroinvertebrates, what are some species that come to mind to you all? And feel free to use the chat here as well. Or what can we eliminate?
Crayfish.
Crayfish, absolutely.
Overweights.
Albermites, oh, one of my favorite fishing baits, the perch and ice fishing. Absolutely. So talking about some insects. Caddisflies, another great one. So you've got insects and we've got a crustacean. There's a few others that we haven't talked about.
How about shrimp? Are they too big?
Shrimp, so we do have like cousins to shrimp, and I may have some of those in my samples today. Absolutely. Scud and side swimmers. Well, clams, and mussels, snails, worms, flatworms, a whole host of species that are under there that I think most of us aren't even aware that we probably have greater diversity in the streams in our ponds than it's probably visible to the naked eye out on land. So I think I hit on most of these. And some great guesses from the audience. I appreciate that. So we mentioned a few insects, and I also had fly larvae on there. And I think it's important to understand how the life cycle of insects work. That in some cases, the dominant phase of their life cycle is spent in the aquatic ecosystem. So insects are going to undergo one of two types of metamorphosis. They either undergo complete metamorphosis or they undergo incomplete metamorphosis. And with some of these species, like a dragonfly nymph, for example, the aquatic phase that I've got one of these right under my leg here that I'll show you in a little bit, it may spend 3 to 4 years in that nymph phase before it metamorphs and emerges as that adult dragonfly. And then maybe it's alive a few weeks or a few months before it lays eggs and then repeats that cycle. Even shorter for others. Have people heard of mayflies in here?
Yeah.
Right, especially if you've seen a mayfly emergence, you're looking at a species, same thing. The nymph phase, the aquatic, where we find them in the water, it could be 2 to 3 years. When they hatch, they don't even have mouth parts. They don't even eat. They're really an adult for one reason, and that's to pass their genes on to the next generation. So, we usually think of adults as like the dominant phase of, the life for things, but that's not necessarily the case with these invertebrates. So the difference between the two has to do with the number of steps that it takes. So with complete metamorphosis, we have 4 phases to the life cycle. And a caddisfly is a great example. We had caddisfly brought up earlier. So they're going to start out as an egg. When they hatch, they're going to become a larvae, kind of like a grub-looking creature. From there, it's going to go in the pupa phase for a couple weeks, and then it emerges as the adult. So 4 phases. One of the keys here is that larvae really looks nothing like the adult does. When we go to incomplete metamorphosis, there's only 3 phases. So here we have an egg, we have a nymph, and then we have the adult. So once again, larvae, really no resemblance to that adult fly. That nymph, however, you know, if you close your eyes a little bit, get a little bit blurry, I think you can envision that if you put a pair of wings on its side, it's more or less the same body plan. So the organisms that we're going to be looking at today are going to be either in the larval form or the nymph form when it comes to these insects. So let's take a guess. Which one is complete metamorphosis? Which one is going to be incomplete metamorphosis?
Is in.
Picture in your mind putting wings on one of those and which looks realistic, because one of those will look like the thing out of nightmares in my mind, right?
So online they say B is incomplete.
Absolutely. So that is a dragonfly nymph over on the right-hand side of those. So once again, I got a few of those today. They're absolute terrors in that tank. They're probably eating everything. And then on the left-hand side, that is a crane fly larva. So crane flies, people call them mosquito hawks. They look like a mosquito on steroids. Back a month or so ago, if you went out in the afternoon and looked down in the grass, you saw a big looking mosquito. It was probably a crane fly. How do you think these species benefit aquatic ecosystems? What roles do you think they play? What's their niche, in other words? I always like testing people to see, let's say, what do you know coming into here? And what are you going to know walking out the door? Why are they beneficial? What job are they doing? What jobs? And Jet is here, who's in my class, you know, might have some answers everybody else does. Why do we need that? Jeff, give me one.
They're typically bottom feet or bottom feeders, as they crawl along the bottom, they sort of help decompose organic matter that gets into our streams.
So those who are joining us via the web, in case you didn't hear, Jet said they're kind of bottom feeders, that they play an important role as decomposers, and that is absolutely correct. So both plant and animal matter, they're recycling that organic content to make it available to other organisms. What do you think? What do others eat? Here we guess. So some do break down the decomposers. A crayfish is a great example of that.
Do they help clean the water at all?
So there are some that help filter out.
Like a zebra mussel?
Absolutely. A zebra mussel, great example. If you look at the amount of gallons that those can filter every single day. Absolutely. And we have other freshwater mussels that we find in the streams as well. Yeah, so really fine organic content, really dissolved material is what they're going to be pulling out. People just shy, or you don't know, and maybe that's why you're here, right? That's my job, is to teach you all some stuff about it.
They probably eat one another.
Absolutely, they eat one another, or in some cases eat things that we would consider to be more advanced or more evolved animals. Excellent point. All right, so some of the things that make them stand out to me, a lot of them are grazing on plant matter, and this is especially important this time of year, now that we're going through leaf off, right? And what I'd say to you is, picture a stream, picture a river that empties into a lake. And I'd ask you to picture, what do you think the water looks like at the start of the stream, maybe halfway, in terms of how many leaves are in it, and how many actually make it out to the lake. You'd be amazed at how good of a job these species do at recycling that organic matter before it heads out to this lake ecosystem. And that's really critical for the health of this lake. As Jack mentioned, important decomposers, food for fish. I'm surprised someone said that in here. Anyone trout fish? If you fly fish, I'm guessing in your lure box, you probably have lures that are designed after some of the invertebrates I'm going to be showing you today. When I said that nutrient cycling, I don't mean to keep going back to it, but especially, you know, we're in a watershed building right now. And I think it's important to note that in a stream, the nutrients that enter that stream, they're normally not found there. They're coming from the watershed, they're coming from the land, right? So picture the leaves that I mentioned to you. So all the energy that plants have been collecting, nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon go into the production of that leaf. If all of those washed out to the lake and they were not available to those plants the following year, do you think it's going to be as productive? Picture a farm, right? Like corporate farming operations where every year you grow crops and you ship them off. What do they need to add year after year after year to continue to get a good yield? More nutrients. Nutrients in a lake, good up to a certain point. I'm sure you've heard or that you've seen things like algal blooms. In here, maybe you've heard of the word eutrophication, especially with harmful algal blooms. These nutrients staying in the stream help prevent those from happening. So it's really critical to both of those ecosystems that there is that balance, that those nutrients stay in the upland and don't come out to a lake, or at least as minimal as possible. So while we're on the topic of leaves, just showing you some of the jobs they do. And I've got a few on here. One that's related to your shrimp, that the side swimmer up there. We've got a crayfish. We've got a couple stoneflies and then an isopod. So the job of these organisms is to take those leaves and to cut them down into smaller pieces. And in the process, oftentimes they may be feeding on some of that matter. But because they take the big leaf and make smaller pieces out of it, that then makes food available for other aquatic inverts. We have grazers. So on the left, we have a mayfly on there. So the mayfly has 3 caudal appendages. I don't know why they didn't start it with a W, but mayfly. We can turn it into an M. We've got a caddisfly, a case-building caddisfly in the middle there. And then on the right, we've got a water pen, one of my favorite ones. So these are going to be eating the algae, the periphyton, the kind of sticky stuff that grows on top of rocks, for example. And then some of the other ones are collectors. So once again, like the crayfish and the side swimmer, the studs, those shredders that I mentioned, they're making smaller pieces available. In this caddisfly, it's a little tough with the lighting in here, but it's making a net out of silk behind it that's capturing those smaller pieces of organic matter that it is then diving on and getting its food. Also have a picture of, not my favorite, the black fly larvae. If you've ever been to the Adirondacks in May, I'm sure you agree with me. And the same thing, I know it's a little tough with the lighting, but if you look along the side of the head, it has these almost like little filter pieces that it has out, catches the organic matter, and is able to pull it into its mouth. Others I call the predators of plants. These are piercers. So organisms more or less that are biting into the plant and stealing, well, stealing is not the right word, borrowing, I guess, a little bit of the photosynthesis or the glucose that these plants are making during photosynthesis. And then we've got the helpermite, ones that are eating other animals. So in this case, this really big beetle larvae that's eating a stonefly. And then the dreaded toe biter. So this is a true bug out of the order Balistomatidae. It basically has a piercing mouth part, and at the end of it, it's almost like a blender. And so I'm taking out turtles, taking out frogs, fish, you name it. It is not what you want in your boot when you work in weapons, trust me. These get up to like 3 inches long, and man, their bite is something fierce.
When you were talking about these leaves that they're shredding and everything else, that's dependent on the leaves sinking to the bottom, right?
It is, or them getting caught up in sticks or along the side in the bank. Usually there's natural traps for leaves as they make their way through streams. So it's not necessarily them sinking, it's them getting caught and hung up long enough for some of these animals to do their work. And yeah, so some make, you know, a leaf into smaller pieces. Some are going to be feeding on like the bacteria and the fungi that are also breaking these leaves down. But it's amazing to look at like the range of decomposition from a whole leaf down to the nutrients and how many different species play a role in that. It's really complex. But also food for other organisms And this is kind of where it starts to tie back into the terrestrial ecosystem. Because like I said, the nutrients that are feeding this stream ultimately need to make their way back out to land. So you can picture not only food for, you know, this trout on here, but it could be for a raccoon, it could be for a mink, it could be for a frog, a number of other species that then bring that energy back out to land. And like I said, it's really critical over time that there is that balance there. And as I mentioned with fly fishing, look at how good a job we do at replicating these organisms. Another one of these cool ones, and the first time I learned about these mussels was I had one of those like moments I thought my head was going to explode. So what you're seeing here are freshwater mussels that have a fleshy appendage that resemble the favorite fish of bass around here, darters. So you can see in that top left and the top right, that's a mussel. So as it's filter feeding, it also puts that out. It can make it wiggle in the current. How do you think a bass responds to that? What's the bass's role in this? Because it's obviously not going to eat that mussel, but it will attack that lure. And when it does so, that mussel releases all of its young and get caught in the gills of the bass. They pinch on, they steal oxygen for a couple days, and then they eventually drop off. So you're talking an animal that has, this mussel is blind, right? It's never seen a darter in its life. How does it know what it looks like? And it has this lure that it makes that is a near replica of that fish. Lots and lots of time in bass going after that appendage that looked more like a darter versus the ones that it didn't when we get this today. So, like I said, I know these probably aren't, you're not fans of these things walking in here, but if nothing else, having an appreciation for what some of these organisms do. Because look, if you care about something, if you understand you care about it, and like I said, you care, that's when you're going to look out for the conservation. Looking at mussels across the US, they're one of the most threatened organisms that are out there, largely due to water pollution that occurred the middle of last century. Somewhere in the neighborhood of like 78% of these have some level of protection that they're threatened. I also think it's important to talk about where these organisms fall on the food chain and the food pyramid. Has anyone seen this before? Food pyramid is representative of the amount of energy that's in an ecosystem. So most of our energy is in our plants, right? So capturing energy from the sun, making sugars, and they're really setting the budget for what else can live in that ecosystem, because basically each step up on this food pyramid, you've lost 90% of the energy that was below it. It goes into, and you can't process everything, there's some waste. It goes into growth, it goes into repair. So where are our organisms falling that we're looking at today? Our macroinvertebrates. I've got 4 different levels on here.
Second level.
Second level. So think about the sheer number of these organisms in an aquatic ecosystem. And what I tell my students in class is, what do we care about on here? Most people. Which step? The fish, and especially those sport fish up at the top, right? If you have a loss of macroinvertebrates, picture that piece of the pie compacting. Everything above it is impacted, and which do you think are the ones we're going to lose? The ones at the top. Absolutely. So like I said, while you may not have a whole lot of interest in macroinvertebrates, I assure you, everyone in this room has an interest in something that eats them, whether it be a bird, whether it be a mammal, whether it be a fish. And you cannot have them without this level of the food chain being healthy enough to support them. Let me give you an example of the number of these. So this top left is Doppler radar, the Mississippi River in Wisconsin in the cross. Right? So what do we see with Doppler radar when we start to see reds and oranges on the news as what's probably coming through? A storm and very, very intense rain. These are mayflies. This is a mayfly emergence on the Mississippi River that's picked up by Doppler radar as heavy rain. If you think, cicadas emerge in mass or locust plagues, they've got nothing on the mayfly. Another photo in that bottom left of a gas station that is absolutely covered in these mayflies. And then along the side of the river, somebody's shoveling. Those are dead mayflies. Once again, they don't have mouth parts. They are alive one day to reproduce and lay their eggs. That's the number of the dead. Think of the energy that is in all of those mayflies. Once again, that goes back to that terrestrial ecosystem. Pull up videos of these. They are absolutely amazing. I've been a part of a couple of these hatches when I did research up on the St. Lawrence River. I've got a picture of my assistant at the time out doing bird monitoring, and he is just covered from head to toe in mayflies.
Are they related to the midges that hatch here?
Midges are a different family, so they're not a true insect like these, more closely related to like a fly. But same thing, midge hatches. A lot of these, it's just cued by a certain temperature. And once it hits that temperature, you just get a mass emergence. And basically the idea here is what they call predator satiation. There are so many out there that it doesn't matter if you're a natural predator of them. You eat to the point that you're just regurgitating them, and then all the rest are left to mate and reproduce.
What do they do to get rid of that? I mean, they just drill them?
I'm not sure what they do in there. My hope would be that they would either put them back in the water or put them up on land, because if you send them to a landfill, that's a whole lot of energy.
You wouldn't want to put them back in the water, would you? You're all dead.
They decompose.
Oh, okay.
That many of them might be a bit of a problem. Ideally, they go up on land, right? And we see this in ecosystems, right? Like when you have this many nutrients, you can actually see them like tree rings. When you get certain events like this, we see a lot of like salmon runs, for example. You can look at below a dam and above the dam where the salmon hit, and the trees that are below the dam grow better than the ones above because of these nutrients being returned. So ideally, yeah, these stay on land at this point. And once again, available, they decompose, turn back into soil and nutrients, and they're available for next year's plants. I gave you a real basic food web, so this is a little more intricate, and this is where, like I said, we start to see some of the other species, the ducks, the bald eagle, the trout, the bass, that ultimately are relying on these invertebrates that I'm talking about today. Now biomonitoring. And this is kind of my last piece that I'll be talking about, the importance of these organisms to science. And especially in the era where we are, where not enough money really goes into science programs and scientific government organizations. You're talking the EPA, their budget is basically what a nuclear sub would cost, is what they need to use to enforce the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, right? A number of pieces of legislation. And we see this too at the state and local level with what our DEC, with our Parks Department, with the budgets that they're given. Money's tight and you need to make sure you're getting the most bang you can for your buck, and biomonitoring plays a real big role here. So the idea behind biomonitoring is that you can look at an ecosystem, the presence and absence of certain species, and use that as an indicator of ecosystem health or impairment. Does that make sense? So there are species out there, they vary in their tolerance for what they can, in terms of different pollutants, or maybe it's the amount of oxygen that's in a stream. If the conditions of the stream hit a critical threshold, these species disappear. Others will still persist, but as a scientist, I can go into that water without having to do a test, without having to grab a sample, bring it back to my lab, which costs money and using expensive chemicals. I can get a snapshot of an ecosystem just based on what I'm finding there. And from there, I can say, you know something, these ones are healthy. We should use them as benchmarks. And these are the ones that are impaired, and this is what we need to focus our time, energy, and our resources to help them recover. So like I said, really quick and dirty method. I've trained a number of individuals, and if I can train it, I'm sure anybody can learn how to do this. And like I said, a lot less expensive and time consuming than some of the traditional ways that we test water quality. Jed, your head is shaking up and down, right? We did some of this in class, how long it took to test for, right? How much road salt was put in the body of water, the dissolved oxygen, and right chemicals that were used. Yeah, shaking it up. Absolutely. So these invertebrates, these were the ones that they really developed the model of biomonitoring for back in like the 1980s. So they got a few characteristics that made them stand out. One of them is they're spending either their entire life or most of their life in the water. That's key, right? So if you don't find them in there, it's not because they're in a different phase of their life. It has to be related to the quality of that habitat. How well do you think these species move? If a pollution event happens, the birds can fly away, the mammals can go elsewhere, even the fish can go to a different spot of that stream. With these species, if it goes bad, really they're gonna die. If they displace themselves and like go in the current, rivers, streams really are different from one section to another. Chances are they're gonna end up in a habitat that's not suitable for them. And the key here is the way they differ in their tolerance. So you have some species, let's talk about dissolved oxygen, for example. If you fall below like, 8 parts per million dissolved oxygen, they're not gonna make it. You have others that can almost make it down to 0. Things like snails and worms and crayfish as well, for example. So like I said, if you look at a stream and all you're seeing is leeches, worms, and crayfish, and you're not seeing, I'll talk about mayflies and stoneflies and caddisflies, we know there's a problem. Even if the problem happened a week ago or a month ago, we can still tell that there was an event and that we need to give this stream our attention. Easy to collect. This is taking a net out in the stream, kicking rocks around, and you dump them into a bucket. As far as identification, the taxonomic level at which we identify them for this purpose, it's really high up. So, we started science kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You may have heard those terms probably way back a long time ago in like high school biology. We're near the top of that. We're identifying these species to like order. If you learn how to identify these down to species, chances are you have letters like MS or PhD after your name, you've got a job for life. Really hard skill. I've got my field guide with me. It's about yay thick or so, a couple inches on the back that I'll show you. It's almost like speaking a different language, learning how to identify these things down to species. So, like I said, just to summarize what I just said a minute ago, the key here is that they vary in their tolerance, right? We have some that are sensitive to pollutants. We have others that can really persist in really heavily polluted waters. And in our cleanest ponds, that's where we're going to find the greatest abundance, the greatest diversity of these organisms and a healthy ecosystem. You look at polluted waters, you're only going to find a handful of species, and they're not able to carry out all the jobs, play all the roles that I've covered over my first half of this presentation. So the idea here is that we group them. Are you sensitive? Are you somewhat tolerant? Or are you tolerant to pollution? And basically from here, we give the species a score. If you're sensitive, you get a real low score. You're a 1 or a 2. If you can deal with a bit of pollution, like the dragonfly nymph that I keep talking about, that I promise I want to show you, you get a score around 5 or 6. And then if you're that crayfish or that leech, you get a score like a 9 or a 10. And basically, we collect these, we sort and identify them, and we can calculate a score for each of these species and get a value for the stream. And based on that value, that's how we know, are you healthy or are you impaired? So what do we find in these different types of water? I've mentioned a few of these. If it's heavily polluted, or if it's clean, you may find leeches, you may find snails in there. It's not necessarily a bad thing to find leeches and snails. It's more the absence of species that require the oxygen. Does that make sense? I know sometimes my students have a hard time with that one. Not you, Jeff, I wouldn't talk about it. Not while you're here, right? We could use them, like I said, for medium clean water, semi-polluted, which is a lot of the water around us, to be frank. We get the dragonfly nymphs. And here's the one I showed here. I talked about several years, 3 to 4 years, as that nymph, before it emerges as that adult dragonfly. And in the meantime, causing havoc in those totes over there. Vicious predator. And then looking at the healthiest of streams, the mayflies, the caddisflies, and the stoneflies. Do you remember the fishing lure that I showed you earlier? Do you remember what species it was? John, I know you know.
I want to say it was stonefly, I can't remember if it had 2 or 3.
It was a stonefly. A lot of our lures that we make, if you're an angler, are based off mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies. What do we try and catch with those? What fish are they specifically after? Trout. Right? So, like I said, maybe you don't care about these invertebrates, but I assure you there's people in here who care about trout. I want to make sure that they're here. Your trout are here because they eat these species. You lose your mayflies, your stoneflies, your caddisflies, your trout are going to go elsewhere, or they're not going to be able to survive long term in that body of water. So how does this tie back to you? What can you take from this talk? Here in the US, 86, I think it's 86, it's between 80 and 90% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. And I've got a map here of the Canisius Lake watershed, and you can see all of the streams that are feeding Canisius Lake. And especially if you look at the east and the south of the lake, it's almost all residential, that green area. What you are doing at your home, on your lawn, in your garden, is impacting these streams, right? So this is why watershed associations are encouraging you to use less fertilizers, to not dump stuff down your storm drain. Doing that is going to help assure that we have these species here long term. So you play a role in this. And if you take nothing else away from this meeting, I hope you understand that piece of it, especially if you are a large landowner. Last slide, I'll just show you. Like I said, I never know who's going to be here. So in case people were interested in going and collecting invertebrates on their own, all you really need is a net, a bucket, and some gumption to go out of the stream, kick rocks over, and dump them into a pail. That's all I got. What can I answer as far as questions? I'm giving the caveat. I love these. I've studied them for years. I'm far from being a specialist with them, so I'll do my best to answer the questions. How's that sound?
I have a question.
Sure.
When I was little, I always used to find a lot of crayfish and a lot of leeches and a lot of live clams. Now all I find are clamshells, no leeches, and we're starting to find crayfish. So what has changed that is causing that?
So for the folks in the audience, just in case you couldn't hear, there was a question from somebody in the audience asking when they were younger, they would often find crayfish, leeches, and clams in bodies of water, and that the clams are really hard for you to find now, and then less of the leeches and the crayfish. A lot of this just has to do with pollution, unfortunately, water pollution. And it's more of a legacy effect. We've done a lot of work since the 70s to clean our streams, especially up here in New York. But we need to hold it to a higher standard. We are better here, and I think given enough time, we'll see those species start to rebound. But yeah, it's not like it was decades ago. And that's really true for insects in general. I tell my students, look, I'm not that old, but I can remember back in, 80s, for example, going on car rides at night with my parents near wetlands, and the number of bugs that would be on the windshield at night. And this is disheartening to me that I live right on the shore of Lake Ontario. I drive by the wetlands every morning and every night. I don't need to do that anymore. We've lost so many insects. And part of what I worry about is kind of a staggering cascading effect. We're seeing these absences now. How long until we start to see the declines of the species that rely on them? They feed a whole lot of organisms that we care about. Any questions in the chat?
No,
Okay,
not at this point.
okay.
John, I've heard two stories about Canisius Lake with regard to the fish population. Canisius Lake used to be a stellar perch fishing lake, especially ice fishing. And, a lot of people have said, I've heard it many times, that what happened to the perch is the alewives came and, decimated the perch because they would eat the food that the perch would eat. But then there was an old timer I talked to when I was out walking, talked to the ice fisherman. He said, I used to catch perch, and when I catch them and throw them out on the ice, they'd spit up freshwater shrimp. And he said, but when they put the sewer line around the lake, they went away. So there's different things could cause.
Absolutely. And a lot of this ties back, believe it or not. So even up in Lake Ontario, a lot of people blame perch declines on the round goby. But it seems it goes deeper than that, almost down to the zebra and aquatic mussels that we talked about. And once again, it's these cascading effects that your perch are feeding on invertebrates like those shrimp or whatever else I may have covered in this talk today. But if they don't have plankton to feed on, right? So more mussels means less plankton, less invertebrates for those to feed on, less perch, not to mention, now you throw in the alewife and there's even more competition, right? So chances are it's more complicated than just one factor. It's probably a whole host, but probably related to, an invasive species.
John, I want to go back a little bit to Ellen's question with respect to the freshwater clams. And this lake was known for its population of freshwater clams. I mean, I've heard it said by some colleagues of mine at Penn State that the western Finger Lakes were akin to French Creek, which is probably the most pristine freshwater clam from New York State's mouth to Clarion of any place in the country. I mean, the number of species that occur in French Creek, but also true for Silver, Canisius, Cuca Lake. Now, is the decline of freshwater clams, we see shells, although I have never seen a live one here. They've got to be there because you've got fresh shells, but is the decline here in Canisius Lake, do you think maybe a manifestation of the eutrophic evolution of the lake? Or is it a more rapid thing with respect to temperature or nutrients or pH?
So we're also seeing declines of freshwater clams in coastal marshes up on Lake Ontario and in the lake itself. With there, once again, we could really tie back to zebra and aquatic mussel invasion, to the fact that you will find clams with zebra, they're covered in zebra and aquatic mussels.
So it's not just competition. Preservation.
It's really intense competition. Some of the plants have worked ways around this. They will actually bury themselves in the sand for an extended period of time until the mussels die. And then they come up. So some are still persisting, and that might explain why you're still seeing some here. This would be a great question for Michael Chislock. You know, definitely deals a lot more with freshwater ecology than I do, as more of a terrestrial ecologist. But from my work for 10 plus years studying these Lake Ontario marshes and going to conferences, and that was one of the things I remember picking up was really that what these zebra and quagga mussels are doing, like I said, really being intense. You know, we say invasive, having, you know, an ill effect on other species or on ecosystems, but, you know, coming to the point where you're attaching yourself to this and then competing as similar as a filter feeder, it's gonna make it tough on that plant. So that's what I know of. There's probably, once again, more to the story than that. That's the bit that I know about. And look, I'm hanging out. You can ask other questions, you can put them in the chat. I know, I keep seeing people eyeballing those couple of crates over there, where I know I've got some of those invertebrates. So by all means, John and I can start pulling some of these out so you can see what they do. They're really wild. Even to look at them, you know, I put them in ice cube trays. Each of them has like their own cube. I talk about their need for like dissolved oxygen. It's wild to watch these stoneflies. They will literally do push-ups in the water to get water circulating to try and get more oxygen. You know, we talk about how form meets function, the number of external gills that you find on these species. Really need to see them up close and in person. Maybe you'll be able to hold one. Don't take them home. That's the only thing I ask. We've got a beast of a crayfish in there that might make a meal for somebody, but yeah, I'll make sure it's back.
There's a question on the screen.
Yeah, so this is a great question, and this is why I do what I do, and other scientists are as well. That great point. People care about megafauna, the birds, the large mammals, and they don't necessarily understand that you need to have these creepy things, as some people refer to them, in order to have those. So a lot of this is just knowledge, right? Having an understanding that that bird or that mammal needs to eat, needs a place to live. Chances are you can tie it back to a plant, an invertebrate, an amphibian, you know, some of these things that I've talked about that don't get nearly the attention that they deserve. And when you have losses down there, it really gets magnified as you go up kind of the trophic level. So yeah, education, sharing of knowledge that these play a role, that they are vital, that maybe you don't care about these invertebrates, but if you care about these other species, you should know that we need to have them around for these other populations to be able to persist a long time. Because like I said, insect declines, it's pretty significant. And at some point, it's going to catch up. If it's not happening already, we're already seeing bird losses, bird declines across the US. We're in the midst of our third breeding bird atlas here in New York, and I'm really nervous for what the findings are going to show. We're in year 2. I think by this year, they'll start getting some data. That's going to get some people's attention. Absolutely.
What's the literature saying about the role of neonicotinoids and 7 and others with respect to aquatic invertebrates? Certainly it's whacking honeybees.
Whacking honeybees, I don't know enough to say. To be frank, I delve into literature, but it is more on the species that I do research on, the salamanders and the amphibians. I know enough to talk about honeybees and other pollinators that, yeah, the neonicotinoids, and especially like some of the studies that are coming out in Europe, showing for honeybee losses and the colony collapse and a number of other things that are driving those losses. Yeah, and 7 and a whole lot of other, and that's
it's centering the water.
And that's just what we know of, right? So some of these, they say, become inert when they bind with soil, for example. We know that some become worse when they hit water. Roundup
Yeah,
is, I think, the key example there. So that's where I do have a whole lot of knowledge for frogs. And, you know, one of the things they say is that if a frog crosses your yard, if you put Roundup, basically has about a 98% chance of dying. If you're using weed begone, atrazine, which is the #2 weed killer that we use in this country, you're talking at parts per trillion is enough to make a male frog turn into a female, to the point that it will hear a male calling, it will mate with them, it will lay eggs, and all the eggs will hatch male. So now we're getting population skews because of this. But think about that, a frog, a vertebrate, a tetrapod, like we are, you're talking probably 90–95% of your DNA similar at least. If it's causing frogs to change sex, what's it doing to us? Fine, maybe it's not even reproductive, but if it's an endocrine disruptor, we know this. It's going to have impacts. Absolutely. That's why I think in New York, you see these things banned almost as soon as they come out. A lot of these chemicals that have disappeared from the time I had another career working in lawn and garden back in the early 2000s. It seems like every few years they start sunsetting certain chemicals once we know that they have these properties to them. But yeah, Roundup is really, Roundup wreaks absolute havoc across people's systems.
try to avoid
So when our neighbors are spraying for spiders on their house or ticks in their lawn or mosquitoes, does that work its way into the water as well?
So like I said, I think a lot of the science says that if it hits soil, it binds, it becomes in dirt. But if it's not in soil, if it's on grass and you get a rain, right, carries it to the low point, can enter the watershed, absolutely. Part of this comes to using things at the recommended dose. And I think that's where, you know, ahead of time, they have to do toxicity testing on these chemicals to see what is a safe level in the aquatic ecosystem. In other words, what are acceptable losses, right? There's some things are going to die. And a lot of people say, well, it says to use 2 teaspoons per gallon, but I'm going to bump it up to 4 because, you know, I had a tick on my dog the other day. Ticks are coming because of climate change, not dying during winter. Look at what's going on in moose in the Adirondacks. They're finding moose calves with literally hundreds of thousands of ticks on their body because it's not being cold enough anymore to kill them. We become Virginia up here in New York. We have their climate now. I mean, like I said, not that old, but I've seen that in my lifetime. Apart from insects, yeah, I enjoy engaging in these conversations because, like I said, people need to know this stuff.
Has there been an increase? There's one invertebrate you didn't talk about, and it wasn't on your list, and I'm sure there are others, but there isn't a person who lives on this lake that doesn't have to bloom and sweep their dock and their boat every morning because of spiders. Is there an increase in spiders? Is it stable? Is it simply the environment for them?
I wish I knew. What I tend to notice is people often find spiders most in late summer, fall, that they're most obvious at that point because they've been feeding, getting ready to lay their eggs, and they've basically been there the entire time, but a lot smaller than the scale. I would expect you're going to have losses with spiders with declines in insect populations, right? I don't cover aquatic spiders. We do get mites in the water, which are a cousin of, they're arachnid, they're arachnid. But spiders are more predaceous where they're on top of the surface. They're not fully aquatic. So they do play a role in aquatic ecosystems, but I don't consider them really part of it where they're more of a terrestrial species. But once again, I'm far from an insect specialist. I always tell my students, if I don't know something, I'm not going to just make something up and make myself look like an idiot if something calls me out. So I have no problem. I'm humble enough to say I don't know.
Nice job. Let's look at some of those.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. That's good to see you.
Fire up the camera and see things there.
Sure. So yeah.
What we're gonna do in this.
Yeah, if we switch this, I'll start pointing out some organisms that we have in here already to the folks who are joining us remotely. I've got a dragonfly and a damselfly nymph in here. Cool. How do I turn the light on? Lamp just as oh, this is. Now, the folks in the audience, we share a camera we have here that. John's gonna focus on critters. If you said it's an autofocus, right? If you said one time, yeah, just push it. We're trying to find. There. Oh, look at them go. So this is the Dragonfly. And one of the cool things about this is they have a jet propulsion basically by taking water and squirting it out of their rear end to be flying. And it's really cool to watch these, right now it knows it's under attention. It's kind of up on dry land, but in the water, you'll see them just take off and dart and basically leaving a wake behind them. What's cool about them, their mouth parts is like the thing of nightmares to a lot of people, that they have an appendage under their jaw called the labium, and they shoot it out, catch their prey, and bring it back and eat it. Very voracious predator. They'll eat tadpoles, they'll eat fish, but this is something, once again, I recommend going on like YouTube or something like that and looking at a video of how these eat. It's really something spectacular.
What is it again, John?
This is a dragonfly nymph.
Okay.
So 3 to 4 years, this will emerge and be a dragonfly.
Is it always 3 or 4 years, or is something triggering it? Light, temperature, or is it a?
So a lot of what we find is how much food is there?
Yeah.
How big can they get? A lot of times, you're right, it can be related to water level. But more often than not, if you have a healthy pond with a lot of food in there, it's going to take a shorter period of time for you to get to a size where you're going to be really fully capable dragonfly. And I'll flip this around. See if I can find this one. We've got the close cousin of the dragonfly, the damselfly. Is being shy. There we go. So you can see those 3 caudal appendages. Try to show the computer monitor. Looks similar to the mayflies.
He's
Once
fast.
again, really.
Is that defensive, or does that act as a tiller?
What's that?
Is that defensive, or does it act as a tiller? Or, I mean,
I'm not sure of the function. Like I said, for movement, A, they crawl, but B, they have, I'm not sure if you're talking, they use water, basically jet propulsion out their back end to really jet if they need to get away. I can take a closer look at that under the microscope. I see it's really wide in surface area, so it could be for obtaining oxygen like we see in a lot of other species.
It's camera shot.
Every time he gets out there, he keeps moving.
You want me to get the monster out?
Yeah, get the monster out, that's fine. See if you can find like a mayfly tube jet would be cool.
Oh, there. I thought it was.
At least it's something we can put in there. We don't need to worry about the dragonfly eating.
I don't know where it came.
Yeah, we'll just zoom back out probably or pick it up.
There it is.
oh, it's one of those horror movies. Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, you get a few of those. That's good eating right there.
We're gonna go eat that one.
Oh, you know, they're eating leaves. So just for the folks at home to see size wise. This is a big one. Definitely longer than my pinky finger, and I'm not gonna get too much closer. Looks like a hermit crab. He's got a beast of a claw there. Hopefully it's not one of the invasive but rusty crayfish. Doesn't have a look of one.
It's kind of a miniature lobster, right?
Same family, same idea,
Yeah.
freshwater. This one's a male.
Is it should be yours?
Females don't have actual sex language, but males, it's.
You're asking great questions. I really wish I knew more about the stuff. I know it has these two.
Yeah.
He has.
This is there, and I can identify it as a male with those.
Oh, this is.
But yeah, this is. Oh, there's all right, we got a Mayfly now.
There we go.
So how do I zoom? Yeah.
Hey, John, we did crayfish eat that mayfly for that chance?
No, these they call it detritivores. They're going after waste products,
Okay,
breaking down dead organic matter.
okay.
Fish.
They find sunfish laying on the bottom bed.
Yeah. So this is the Mayfly that I've got on here right now. And of course, it's camera shy. Hopefully it doesn't get too close to the dragonfly or you don't want you to shove it home. A little too big for this. So there's the damselfly nymph for comparison size wise. But with the Mayfly, it's those three tail pieces, what they call the caudal appendages, that we know it's a Mayfly. If I were to zoom in closer, if I had a microscope, you'd be able to see all the external gills that it has on the abdomen, kind of back by the legs.
This is a crayfish. Well, this one is just much smaller, but one of
Oh,
these
this
is
one.
now, the other is flat. I mean,
We got a big, very fast Mayfly. You can see it a little bit. I can see it on the screen. Those external gills, you can see it beating by the base of the legs. And those are those gills trying to circulate, move new water around to get the oxygen they need. Yep, see the fluttering on it.
Yep.
So would that be about an inch long altogether?
This here is probably a little over half inch.
Look, you can't get a scale from there.
Exactly, there's no background.
Yeah, very cool. That's a great reason.
Yeah, there's that fluttering. And then of course he's off.
All 60 years.
Good thing I didn't pay these animals in advance to cooperate, right? Oh, there goes the dragonfly. This is what I did.
I know, I should put it back.
So the dragonfly nymph is at the bottom of your screen, the Mayfly nymph is up at the top. Like I said, keep your eye on this area that just had a good look at it, the beating underneath there. Once again, moving water, hitting the oxygen that it needs to live. Mayfly says, I'm out of here before it gets eaten.
Lunch.
I've seen in my class more stoneflies eaten by those dragonflies than care to recall.
I don't at all.
I saw some
Going
earlier.
away.
I'm looking here.
Thank you,
Nope,
thank
all
you.
right. Hey, Jack, will you keep your eye out for a non-biting midge?
What are the midgets?
The red ones?
There's one in there, Don had one,
Okay.
right?
Oh, yeah, those.
I didn't realize that's what
Do we have midges or mayflies?
These are mayflies. We do have midges, and I'm trying to get someone to.
No,
bring
I
them.
mean here.
They're midgets.
I have heard people refer to mayflies as midgets.
Yeah,
So
But they're
I think that's
they're different.
different. They're definitely different technically, but I think people, and that's the fun of a common name,
They call them mayflies.
Right.
They're not
Yeah.
mayflies.
or vice versa. Yeah, I've heard like we have a midge out there, but they're mayflies. Yeah, so there is a chironomid or a non-biting midge, that red looking worm.
Because of, they're basically see-through because of the hemoglobin, right?
Does that help?
The leg worms are like that. I'm trying to remember that's the other name for these. You're right, there are ones that do have hemoglobin and give them that
The red.
look. But yeah, you can see 2 legs towards the front, 2 legs towards the rear. Caught on some silk. There we go.
Yeah, I'll keep up with it.
yeah.
It's like my kidder characters have Mountain Dew.
Yeah.
There's very tiny birds that eat it.
This is a little more clear. You can see it has a pronounced head.
There's only guys on the side.
And little whitey parts up at the front, and then a couple little like T-Rex arms right underneath the head, and a couple right at the back on the boat. But I got the dissecting scope. Definitely would take a peek at it under there and see some of these features up close. It's more resolution. When I zoom in, you lose that clarity as to that. Yeah, so these are, yeah, so that's a larvae. Oh, there we go. So we've got, no, Don just brought up the crane fly. Zoom out a little bit.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, to see him go flying.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can get this light over it. In the better camera. Yeah. So once again, when this metamorphs resembles a big mosquito. And this worm, once again, for scale, it's probably an inch long. So what are you looking for? I think you can understand the amount of energy that it takes to undergo metamorphosis, how much mass this loses from this larval stage to the adult, to be that little fly. External gills on the back end of it, they go in and out, getting air. Yes. Once again, they have some really cool adaptations that allow them to live longer.
Was that a fixing over on those gills? Is that?
I had to this. These are free, and that's been here. That one.
Oh.
So they're one of those cases. There's other ones that are free living. Nope, that's not caddisfly. That looks like an overfly. So if you look at the back end of it, once again, a fan-like gills that come out the back end that are retractable. I think he just went to his creative pond, but a lot of us. Not the. Yeah, that's I just like watching.
Yeah, they're gills.
Keep going up.
Oh,
there.
it's gone right up at the.
Yeah, right up to the surface.
Surface.
Yeah, you guys got some really good looks at those gills on the crane fly larvae coming up and getting air.
It ended up being an alder fly. Because it has a problem coming up, you just get.
I'm 99% sure it's an alder fly. I've got a sheet. You can use for ID, and I printed out a bunch of people to take them home. So those are gills. Yeah, so those are external gills that it's putting out to get the air and oxygen. I think this is what Jeff brought up a minute ago, was the alder fly. And I can tell the way it walks, so these are free living, so they basically spit in a net and hang on to it. They would be on their side in the water with these really small legs, not spread out and kind of walking, and also these gill features on the outside. That it looks like a small butterfly. Oh, yeah. So that's a Mayfly right there, so that's one of these, so you can see the three, what they call the caudal appendages, or the tail parts. So this is a real good indicator that you've got a lot of solid oxygen. Yeah, so it's hard to see on there, but this will be see the three parts of the body, and the whole idea is constantly moving new water over this.
So it's, okay.
It's three moving healthy
When you see a lot.
absolutely.
Your trusting soul, Charlie, sitting that close to that thing right over.
Yeah, I know. He's
Oh,
batting that guy away.
He's got, it looks like his horse.
whoa.
On the side.
Yeah.
That was pretty entertaining.
Yeah.
That was definitely defensive.
Yeah. Yep, that's one. I think that's cool. So there's that Scott saxophone right there. And they kind of extra. We could try getting the petri dishes and putting some on the salt and not right. I think there's enough light in here, we should be able to, but there's nothing else. Better shine the phone.
There's nobody online now.
On that train.
Nobody online?
Nope.
They've seen enough.
Yeah.
Not the same, but hey, we do our best to bring it back
Yeah.
to their living room, you know?
That's the,
Oh, there's a beast with a fire in it.
that's the Mayfly.
So you can see on the underside of the mouth. Yeah, that's that lady that it projects out and shoots it out and catches prey. It's really like lightning fast. It's almost like a cricket. But it's one that I sort of. Looking good for like one of the moving photographs in here. To show.
Oh, look at that.
Right? I think it's cheaper.
Especially when some big guy comes after the Mariposa.
Yeah.
So take that, right? Wow, look at that.
Oh.